So the Lions at San Francisco, the Lions who have given up 7 points to the Niners here. And the key to this game for me is the Lions' run defense. Like 18 months ago, the Lions were one of those defenses that you targeted every single week in DFS because they just couldn't defend the run at all. And then a switch flipped at one point. I think it was around the bye week in the 2022 season. And now they're truly excellent against running backs, particularly in fantasy. They gave up the fewest fantasy points to the running back position. They allow 64 rushing yards per game over the last 5. That's 42 fewer than the Ravens, who are viewed as an excellent rush defense. But the Lions, their big weakness is the passing game. They give up 346 passing yards over the last 5. They also allowed 2.2 receiving touchdowns per game. So they find themselves in these situations where they have to put up points. And I don't mind leaning into that kind of narrative here if we expect the Niners to be good. The vibes around the Niners aren't particularly good at the minute. And ever since Brock Purdy played the Ravens, it seems like his play has been shaky at best. And now we've got this new narrative that Brock Purdy can't play in the rain. So it's worth paying attention to that. But the Niners, they've quietly gone about their business. They've won 4 of their last 5 meaningful games. They've put up 27 points per game while doing so. So there's no reason to be particularly fearful of them. Goff, he's the cheapest of the 4 starters on the 2-game slate. And it feels fair to say his range of outcomes is probably as high as any. He's had 3 games over 20 points in the last 6 games. He's also had 3 games below 15 points in that time. He's only had 3 games with 300 passing yards all year. So when Goff does perform well for fantasy, it's typically by throwing multiple touchdowns. So if you're playing Jared Goff, you need to understand that you're saying that he's going to throw a bunch of touchdowns on Sunday. That means you're probably looking at double or triple stacking him. The Niners, they've allowed 5th fewest quarterback fantasy points this year. Over the last 5 games, they've allowed 189 passing yards and 1.6 passing touchdowns. So even though they've been good against the quarterback position, you can pass on them a little bit. Brock Purdy, we talked about it already. He's in shaky form, to say the least. But his surrounding weapons and Kyle Shanahan just truly make him worth playing every single time he takes the field. Before week 16, Purdy had only 1 game below a 60% completion rate all year. And then since then, he's had 3 games below that point. So it's definitely a little bit alarming. But this is the bounce back spot of all bounce back spots. The Lions, they allow the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, over 346 passing yards per game. So if Purdy is going to pay off this week, it's by hitting the 300 passing yard bonus and throwing for at least 2 touchdowns, which feels very viable. Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be an incredibly popular play because he scored 12 rushing touchdowns this year, despite the fact that the Lions favor David Montgomery in short yardage situations, or even Craig Reynolds last week. But Gibbs, he's shown that he can score from anywhere on the field. He's an absolute speed demon. Gibbs has scored over 16 points in 5 of the last 7 games, scored a touchdown in all but 1 game since week 13. David Montgomery, though, has seen his value kind of diminish over that period. Since week 12, he's not been over the 15-point mark once, and he's scored 6 touchdowns in that time. It's quite hard not to score over 15 points if you're scoring touchdowns, but he's managed it. The Niners, you can run on them. Their run defense ranks 15th in DVOA. They've allowed 128 rushing yards and 0.8 rushing touchdowns over the last 5 games. That's the worst of any team left in the playoffs. So if the game script is close, then I don't mind running out David Montgomery. I don't mind running out Jahmyr Gibbs. The Lions would be quite smart to try and keep this close and keep the running game involved, because that's an area which the Niners will give up yardage. CMC, most expensive player on the slate, the only player above 8,000. He is 9,000 on DraftKings. He scored over 28 points on 7 occasions this year, 23 touchdowns through rushing and receiving. But the Lions, they are a tough run defense. They allow only 64 yards per game, 0.2 touchdowns. If you're fading CMC, then you have to be viewing it as leverage. So last week, the one for me that stood out was I was fading CMC because I wanted to play Deebo Samuel aggressively. And it felt like that was going to be the right move when the Niners came out and Deebo was a clear part of the game plan early on. And then, of course, he gets injured and they have to change on the fly. This week, though, I prefer to play it differently, and we'll get to that in a second. But the Lions wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown, highest priced wide receiver on the slate, almost twice as expensive as the next nearest Lions wide out. He is 7,900. St. Brown scored over 21 points in all of his last 6 games. It's an incredible level of consistency for a player, not a quarterback. I think here that you could definitely play him because the Niners allow 13th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And he's just such a volume hog. Jameson Williams, he's 3,700. He was out-targeted last week by Josh Reynolds. Sorry, Jameson Williams out-targeted Josh Reynolds last week. He had 4 targets to Reynolds' 3, but it was Reynolds who outscored him again because he scored the touchdown. I just have to lean towards Reynolds. People want to chase the ceiling with Jameson Williams. But we've not seen it. The guy never scores double-digit points. It's a really hard click for me. Deebo Samuel, like I mentioned, he was looked set to be a big part of the game plan, and now he's not practicing, or he's practicing in a limited fashion because of a shoulder injury. But this game, this sets up for Brandon Ayuk, 6,900, 400 cheaper than Deebo Samuel. The Lions, they've played man coverage at the 3rd highest rate of any team in the league over the last 6 games. Ayuk leads the Niners with a 28% target per route run share against that coverage. Whereas Deebo dominates against zone looks. When you come up against a defense that lean heavily into zone, that's when you play Deebo. Man coverage, this is Ayuk. Ayuk's had 7 games over 100 receiving yards in the regular season, and the Lions, talked about already, give up 346 passing yards per game along with 2.2 touchdowns. It just shapes up for a monster week. If you're looking for a captain suggestion for the showdown slates, it's Ayuk. If you're looking for a player who's an absolute must play on the main slate, it's Ayuk. If Deebo can't play, Juwan Jennings will come back into play. He had 5 catches for 61 yards against the Packers. You play possibly Ronnie Bell as a dart throw, but he was inactive last week. Sam Laporta at 5,400. He had a much better outing last week against the Bucks. 11 targets, 65 yards. That was a week after he only had 3 targets and 14 yards in the wildcard round. The Niners, they are good against the tight end position. They're not leaky there anyway. But, you know, we've seen good tight ends have good days against them. All it's going to take for Sam Laporta is 50 yards and a touchdown, and he'll pay off. George Kittle, 5,300. He's had over 65 receiving yards in 4 of his last 6 games, playing a defense allowing the 8th most tight end fantasy points, giving up the 5th highest yards per reception and the 7th most yards per game to the tight end position. Kittle's one of my favorite plays of the week. I think you can look at this and go, okay, I'm going to play Brock Purdy double stacked with Kittle and Ayuk, and I'm going to use that as leverage away from the chalk CMC teams. I'm going to play them, and I'm going to play some cheaper running backs to make up for it. And then I'm just going to jam in studs. And I think that could definitely be a fruitful way to go about things. That's the end of this week's show. Nice short one. Obviously, not too many games to talk about. We will be back for the Super Bowl preview. Hit that like, hit that subscribe button. Let me know who you're building your teams around this weekend. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I will always answer every single one.